Being one of the first large-scale mechanized and industrialized conflicts between nations, World War I is full of weapons, technology, and equipment. A lot of the trappings of modern warfare came from this conflict or were perfected during it: tanks, airplanes, weaponized poison gas, submarines, aerial bombardment. But there's a piece of equipment that's absolutely critical to the outcome of the First World War, which I think was absolutely decisive. And here it is: the ocean liner. Yes, you heard me right. Ocean liners. Not a weapon, not an advanced technology, not even very new at the time of the war. Ocean liners were critical to the Allied victory in World War I, to the point where I don't think the Allies could have won without them. In this video, I'm going to explain this surprising conclusion, and I hope to prove it to you. Hi, Sean here, and welcome to another nautical history video, and welcome back to World War I, which I haven't covered since my Meaning of the Titanic video essay back in the summer. On this channel, I do ship histories of both military and civilian ships, and admittedly, this one sort of blurs the line. My thesis in this video is that civilian ocean liners used by the Allied governments in wartime were critical to their overall victory in the First World War. I think you can make a strong case that some of the great floating palaces of the era, Mauretania, Aquitania, Leviathan, and such, made a huge difference in the Allied war effort. I'm going to be talking about how all these ships got into military service during the war years and what they did during those years, but I'm going to start not with the ships themselves and not even at the beginning of World War I, but at the end. After 4 long years of fighting, the First World War ended on November 11, 1918, when the German government signed an armistice with Allied powers in a rail car in the forest outside of Compiègne in France. This was 2 days after Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and the Imperial German government collapsed. When the overall strategic story of the First World War is told, often this end piece goes something like this. The decisive intervention in the war was that of the United States, which declared war on Germany on April 6, 1917. American troops began arriving in large numbers on the Western Front in the spring of 1918, and battles involving Americans began ramping up in the summer. A series of victories in the late summer and fall of 1918, such as the famous Meuse-Argonne offensive, proved to the Germans they couldn't win, and they pulled the plug by signing the armistice. That's all true enough, but it's not the whole truth. It's a little misleading because it suggests that the Germans were defeated on the Western Front militarily. That's not really how it went down. Indeed, Germany's capitulation was largely a game of numbers, and especially of logistics. The logistics piece, is where ocean liners come in. When ocean liners and World War I appear together in the same thought, the discussion is almost always about a specific ocean liner, namely this one, the RMS Lusitania. The sinking of this ship by the German submarine U-20 on May 7, 1915, clearly was one of the most important events of the war. It did challenge the neutrality of the United States, and President Wilson gave an ultimatum to Germany. Basically, stop unrestricted submarine warfare, or we, meaning the US, will come into the war on the Allied side. The Germans wisely stopped the practice, or more accurately, paused it. But I'm not going to talk very much about the Lusitania beyond this mention of her. As interesting and pivotal as the Lusitania is in the story of the war, she's not really that relevant to the main point I'm trying to make. Let's rewind a bit. Not even to the beginning of World War I, but to before the beginning, to the end of the first golden era of floating palace ocean liners, in those last couple of years before 1914. This era arguably began in 1897, when the Germans introduced the Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse, the first 4-stacked ocean liner. There was an arms race of sorts going on between Britain and Germany, not merely in naval armaments, although that certainly was going on, but also in terms of ocean liners. Each country, Britain and Germany, and each of the 2 major passenger lines within each country, Cunard and White Star on the British side, and North German Lloyd and Hamburg America line in Germany, were trying to outdo each other with the biggest, longest, heaviest, most luxurious, and especially fastest passenger ships on the North Atlantic. This competition led to some of the great examples of ocean liner craft in this period. This is how we got some of the truly great ships, like Lusitania and Mauretania, the Cunard sisters, in 1906 and 1907 respectively. They were later joined in 1914 by a near sister, Aquitania. White Star introduced Olympic in 1911 and Titanic in 1912, the latter one not going so well, and their near sister, Britannic, which was under construction at the time the war broke out. The Germans had Imperator, briefly the largest ship in the world in 1913, and then the gigantic Vaterland, again the largest ship in the world. Both the German Vaterland and Britain's Aquitania made their debuts on the North Atlantic in the spring of 1914. So by summer 1914, several of the largest ships in the world were making regular passenger runs between North America and Europe, and one of those, Mauretania, was also the fastest ship in the world. Then some extremely unfunny events occurred beginning at the end of June 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, there was a bunch of diplomatic wrangling, and ultimately the two major armed camps of Europe, the Allies and the Central Powers, were at war by the end of the first week of August. That ocean liners would take part in the war and be used primarily as military assets was pretty much a foregone conclusion. In fact, many of the biggest liners, which were hellaciously expensive to build, were subsidized by governments, Germany's and Britain's, on the understanding that in times of war, these very large ships could be requisitioned for military use. But that understanding was more theoretical and experimental than real or practical for a surprising amount of time into World War I. The issue was that, at least at the beginning, governments weren't really sure how best to use these large, fast ships with enormous capacities for hauling human beings long distances across the ocean. I mean, you'd think the answer would be intuitively obvious, but really it wasn't. Take, for example, what happened to the Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse. In the early days of the war, the Germans outfitted her as an auxiliary cruiser with a mission to go out and sink British merchant shipping. This didn't end up working so well. The Kaiser Wilhelm tangled with a British Royal Navy cruiser off the North African coast, but ran out of ammunition. So her captain blew up the ship, and it sank. There were a few other attempts to turn ocean liners into military vessels, but they really didn't work too well. They were fast, yes, but they consumed huge amounts of fuel, much more so than military vessels. So a lot of the large liners were converted into hospital ships. Here, for example, is the Britannic, a White Star liner, who never sailed as a civilian passenger liner. She went from the launch dock right to military service as a floating hospital, and was sunk by a mine in November 1916. The British finally did figure out how ocean liners could best help the war effort. Because the British Empire was so spread out, troops had to be gotten from one continent to another as fast as possible. So ships like Mauretania and Aquitania were especially good for this. They also had the chance for some trooping duty beginning in late 1915, when the British started on their ill-fated Gallipoli campaign. But not all liners were pressed into service. The Cunard Line and the British government, for example, intended for Lusitania to go right on making civilian crossings. German submarines were a threat, yes, but before May 1915, they weren't thought of as a huge threat. In the case of Lusitania, the British made two gambles. First, that she was too fast to get caught by a U-boat, and second, even if she wasn't, the Germans wouldn't dare sink such a large passenger liner without warning. On May 7, 1915, as we know, they lost both of those gambles. Germany's largest ships, incidentally, also did not end up in military service. Vaterland, in particular, was laid up at Hoboken, New Jersey, from August 1914 onward. The U.S. was neutral, and the British Navy had blockaded the German coast, so from the German perspective, the safest thing to do with this ship was to leave her in New York. That would prove a costly mistake, as we'll see. Imperator also never went into military service for Germany. She spent the war laid up at her dock in Hamburg. The important fact here is that when it came to large, fast ocean liners, the Allied countries had several, and Germany and the Central Powers didn't, at least none they could use. Now we have to turn for a moment to global strategy. On land, at least, in the most important theater of war, France, the conflict bogged down by late 1914. The British, French, and German armies were dug into trenches on the Western Front, and while there was fighting on the Eastern Front between Germany and Russia, a lot of it in fact, it was always assumed that the status of Paris would decide the war. If the Germans could capture it, they would win, and if the Allies could prevent it, the Germans would lose. Both sides were extremely frustrated at the stalemate. Most of the major battles in World War I that you've probably heard of, such as the Somme, Passchendaele, or Verdun, came about as a result of attempts by the generals to break the stalemate, usually with huge numbers of troops, which is why these battles were incredibly bloody. They didn't work. The front lines didn't move a whole lot. By early 1917, the Germans were particularly desperate. Their economy looked like it might give out before the British did, largely because Britain was getting infusions of cash, food, and supplies from the United States, that North Atlantic lifeline. This is what caused the Germans to unpause that policy of unrestricted submarine warfare that they had put a hold on to placate Wilson and the United States. It's not that they didn't know that as soon as submarines started going around sinking neutral ships again, that the United States would probably declare war. They knew that. But the German military leaders, particularly Hindenburg and Ludendorff, the main army commanders, were gambling. The United States had a very small standing army in 1917. Even if the Americans did declare war, they would first have to raise an army from scratch, and then second, to make a real difference on the Western Front, they'd have to get that army over to France to fight in the trenches. This would take time. Hindenburg and Ludendorff were gambling that they could use Germany's submarines to sever Britain's lifeline to North America, and the British would collapse or at least weaken significantly before American forces could make a difference on the battlefield. This was not a bad gamble, to be sure. See, Hindenburg and Ludendorff had another scheme in the works too. It involved knocking Russia out of the war by sending a certain hot-headed revolutionary, one Vladimir Lenin, back to Russia from where he'd been exiled in Switzerland, and if possible, helping him foment a revolution against the shaky Russian provisional government, which had just taken over after Tsar Nicholas II was deposed. The idea was that Lenin, if he got into power, would immediately take Russia out of the war. Then Germany could shift their armies from the Eastern Front over to the Western Front, throw them against the French and British, who in this scenario would be near exhaustion themselves, capture Paris, and voila, the war is won. Pax Germaniae. Yes, I realize I left out the Zimmermann telegram. I'm aware it exists, but I'm just going to skip right over it. Honestly, I don't think it's that important. Anyway, for a while, this Rube Goldberg-like German scheme to win the war seemed to be on track for success. Lenin got to Russia in April 1917. U-boat sinkings of Allied ships increased sharply. Lenin did take over the Russian government in November 1917, and he did take Russia out of the war. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk seemed to the Germans like a masterstroke. As soon as that was a done deal, Hindenburg and Ludendorff indeed started shipping all the armies they could spare to the Western Front. On March 21, 1918, the Germans launched the big offensive in the West that they thought, or at least hoped, would win the war. This is sometimes called the Ludendorff Offensive. At first, they did have some success, but as they always did in World War I, the offensive bogged down. The Germans broke through here and there, sometimes significantly, but they couldn't follow it through to victory. It may seem like I've completely lost the track here. I haven't mentioned ocean liners in several minutes, but this is the part where they come back into the story. If you've been paying attention, you can guess where this is going. On April 2, 1917, President Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war against Germany, which Congress granted 4 days later on April 6th. Suddenly, Germany was an enemy power. Well, remember the Vaterland, which had been collecting barnacles in Hoboken since the war broke out in Europe? Now that she was enemy property, she could be legally seized, and she was the largest passenger ship in the world. The use of ocean liners as troop ships was by now finally clear to military planners on both sides of the Atlantic. These ships didn't work as armored vessels, and with most of the fighting being inland in France, you only need so many hospital ships. But the liners had two advantages that no purpose-built military ships possessed: incredible speed and huge hauling capacity. The ocean liners were now poised to make a difference. Vaterland, which was quickly renamed Leviathan, was the first experiment in large-scale transatlantic troop hauling from the US to Europe. Originally, its capacity was about 7,000 troops, and a major problem was that it was so big that only a few select ports in Britain or France could handle it. Eventually, though, the Allies went full throttle to use these assets to their greatest capacity, especially after the Germans attacked again in March 1918. Aboard Leviathan, the US Navy developed the strategy of hot bunking, which meant that one shift of troops would wake up and get out of bed, and a second shift would take their places in the bunks. There were bunks crammed into every available space. This instantly doubled Leviathan's troop hauling capacity. The threat of U-boats was a constant danger, especially in the final stages of the voyages when the ships neared the French coast. Ocean liners had very little in the way of practical defenses, so speed was really the main strategy against submarine attacks. That and dazzle painting. Dazzle painting was developed initially by the British. Instead of just painting the ships flat gray like most warships, liners were painted in weird abstract patterns, usually in blue, gray, white, and black. The idea was that the shapes would make it harder for U-boats to tell which direction a ship was going, because it'd be harder to spot the water breaking against her bow. There was no actual evidence that this worked at all, but dazzle painting continued to be heavily used, not just for the remainder of World War I, but the Second War as well. Leviathan was not the only ocean liner to be developed as a high-speed, high-capacity transport. The British started using Mauretania for North Atlantic trooping too, and Aquitania and Olympic as well. Sometimes these ships carried British troops from Canada over to France, but all of them also carried Americans. Mauretania was known as the HMS Tuber Rose during her wartime service. I have no idea whose idea that was, but anyway. The heyday of the ocean liner transports was the spring and summer months of 1918. The United States had finally raised its army, having instituted the draft, and there were troops of some value streaming out of the training camps. The voyages aboard the liners were hot, cramped, smelly, and probably utterly disgusting. Can you imagine the toilet situation on these voyages? But it worked. By summer 1918, the American ranks were swelling, and the Germans had nothing more to send. So now, back to strategy and logistics. In a broad sense, the big gamble the Germans had made in early 1917, their plan to win the war, almost worked. They injected Lenin like poison into Russia, nearly brought Britain to her knees with U-boats, and readied their army for what might have been the decisive blow on the Western Front. It went wrong for two reasons. First, they couldn't land the knockout blow, the Ludendorff Offensive of March 1918, and second, once they had shot that load, the arrival of the American army in France in significant numbers meant there was no chance to try again. The ocean liners were utterly crucial in that second reason why the German plan didn't work. By 1918, both France and Britain were largely exhausted. The United States could eventually have gotten their army to France, but without the liners, if they had to rely on slower and smaller troop transports, how much longer might it have taken? The speed and hauling capacity of ships like Leviathan, Aquitania, and Mauretania significantly shortened the window the Germans had to win, if they were ever going to. So I said early on that it's a little misleading to maintain that American victories on the ground, like the Meuse-Argonne offensive, were instrumental in convincing Germany to quit. It's not incorrect to say that, but it's more correct to say that the Germans looked at the vast numbers of American troops coming off the ships in France and said, you know what, there's just no path to victory anymore. That was why they quit. It was a numbers game. The Allies had more, and more were coming all the time. And a huge number of them came on converted ocean liners. When the war was over, the duty of the ocean liners wasn't finished. All those troops they had hauled over to France from Canada and the United States had to be gotten back home again. But at least on the return voyages, there weren't U-boats prowling around anymore. The post-war lives of the liners and their return from military service is an interesting story in itself, but it's not this one. I hope this video has made you think a little differently about the First World War than you might otherwise have. If you're a first-timer here and you like what you see, check out the Ship Histories and the Nautical Mysteries and Disasters playlists on this channel. Chances are good that you'll find something else you might like and learn from. So please do all the things you normally do for a video you like. Press the like button or leave a comment or subscribe. I've got a lot of interesting stuff on this channel, and not just ship histories. So look around. My historical movie analyses, such as the one I did on Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, are also a lot of fun. So thanks so much for watching, and I hope you'll look me up again for another journey into the past. Smooth sailing and safe travels.